Have you ever wondered how safe we truly are when we trust familiar routines and familiar people? The, sto- the story begins in a place that feels ordinary: a quiet home, a calm afternoon, nothing that suggests danger. A small outdoor camera records a short moment. It shows an elderly man sitting in a wheelchair. His body is weak, but his face looks peaceful. A caregiver stands beside him. She wears simple work clothes. She speaks softly. She leans closer for a brief moment of affection. Then she gently pushes the chair back toward the house. The camera stops there. No tension. No warning. Just the end of another workday. At first glance, this moment means very little. It looks like kindness. It looks like care. It looks like trust built over time. For the woman, this was part of her routine. She worked in private homes, helping people who could no longer manage alone. Her job required patience and emotional strength. There were no applause or public recognition, just quiet responsibility. She had chosen this work after life redirected her plans, not because it was easy, but because it mattered. She showed up every day. She listened. She noticed small details others missed. The man she cared for had once been independent. An accident had taken away much of his freedom. Movement became limited. Days became long and quiet. At first, his family visited. Then visits slowed. Eventually, most stopped coming at all. Loneliness settled in quietly, not all at once, but slowly, like dust in an empty room. When the caregiver arrived in his life, she did not change things overnight. She helped with meals. She kept track of medication. She made sure appointments were not missed. But over time, something deeper formed. Conversation replaced silence. Music filled empty hours. Simple attention restored dignity. This kind of care does something powerful. It reminds people that they are still seen, still valued, still human. The man began to smile again. He laughed more. He looked forward to mornings. And the caregiver noticed the change too. She saw how connection could heal more than medicine, how presence could ease pain that could not be treated. But not everyone viewed this change with relief. When family members eventually returned, they saw a difference they did not expect, not just in the man's mood, but in the closeness between him and the caregiver. Concern surfaced, then suspicion. Questions followed. Was this professional? Was it appropriate? Was something being taken advantage of? The caregiver felt the shift immediately. Conversations grew tense, eyes lingered longer, silence replaced small talk. Still, she continued her work. She believed consistency would calm the situation. That trust, once explained, could be restored. Most people believe that. What she did not know was that routines can become predictable. Predictability can be observed, and observation can quietly turn into planning. The short video from that camera would later be studied closely, not because of what happened on screen, but because of what happened after. Because once someone fails to return home, every ordinary moment becomes a question. And this routine, once unnoticed, was about to take on a meaning no one expected. What happens when concern is no longer about care, but about control? After that quiet day, the routine continued. Morning visits, careful meals, long conversations that filled empty hours. From the outside, nothing appeared unusual. But inside the home, emotions were shifting. The man's family began to visit more often. Not regularly, not warmly. Their presence felt measured, observing rather than reconnecting. They watched how the caregiver spoke to him, how she adjusted his chair, how she knew his preferences without asking. These small details did not comfort them. They unsettled them. The man noticed this tension immediately. He had lived long enough to recognize distance disguised as concern. Questions were framed politely, but the meaning beneath them was sharp. Was he thinking clearly? Did he still understand decisions? Was he being influenced? Hearing these questions hurt more than his physical limits ever had. He had lost movement, not awareness. He had lost strength, not judgment. Emotionally, he felt cornered. The people who had been absent were suddenly protective. Protective of him, they claimed. Protective of something else, he suspected. The caregiver sensed the shift too. Her presence was no longer welcomed. It was evaluated. She began documenting her work more carefully. Arrival times, tasks completed, conversations held in shared spaces, not because she had done anything wrong, but because the atmosphere no longer felt safe. She questioned herself late at night. Had she crossed a line by caring too deeply? Was kindness now something to defend? Still, she returned each day. because walking away felt like abandoning someone who finally felt seen. The man struggled with guilt. He worried that her presence had caused conflict, that his happiness had become a problem. One afternoon, he spoke honestly. He said he felt alive again, that laughter had returned, that routine had meaning. His words were calm, clear, thoughtful. They were not received that way. Family members exchanged looks. Silence followed, then firm suggestions. They proposed changes, different care, less time together, more structure. The man refused. This refusal marked a turning point. From that moment, discussions moved away from emotion and into paperwork. Appointments were requested, opinions were sought, questions were asked behind closed doors. The caregiver did not know the full extent of this activity. She only felt the pressure growing, like being watched without seeing who was watching. Trust, once broken, does not simply disappear. It reshapes behavior. She varied her schedule slightly, parked in different places, paid closer attention to who was nearby, not out of fear, out of instinct. Meanwhile, the man made a decision of his own, one rooted in gratitude rather than obligation, in presence rather than blood. He wanted his future to reflect who had been there for him, who had restored dignity when it was slipping away. This choice was private, legal, thoughtful. But decisions like this rarely stay contained. Information travels, sometimes through unintended paths, sometimes through people who believe loyalty overrides confidentiality. When word of his decision reached his family, reactions were immediate. Shock, anger, then silence. Silence that was not peaceful. Silence that calculated. The caregiver noticed the change before anything was said aloud. Messages went unanswered. Glances became colder. Doors closed more firmly than before. She wondered if stepping away might ease things, if distance could protect everyone. But she stayed, because leaving felt like surrendering trust to fear. What none of them fully understood was that routines, once observed closely enough, reveal patterns, and patterns can be used. As calm as life seemed on the surface, something had already shifted beneath it, and the consequences of that shift were quietly moving closer. How often do we mistake silence for acceptance, without realizing it may be something far more dangerous? In the days that followed, the home felt different, not louder, not openly hostile, just heavier. Conversations ended sooner. Smiles felt practiced. The air carried an unspoken weight. The caregiver continued her routine. She arrived, she worked, she listened. But she also observed. She noticed unfamiliar cars parked down the street. She noticed when her arrival time seemed anticipated. Small things, easy to dismiss, hard to ignore. The man sensed it too. He felt watched, not physically threatened, but emotionally pressured. Like every choice he made was being quietly measured. He asked if she felt uncomfortable. She hesitated before answering, then said she was fine. It was a gentle lie, meant to protect him from worry. Family communication became brief and formal. Messages focused on logistics. Nothing about feelings, nothing about reconciliation. Behind the scenes, conversations were happening elsewhere, not in the home, not where warmth had returned. Decisions were being discussed without the man present. Options weighed, outcomes imagined. The caregiver was never invited into these discussions. She became a topic, not a participant. At work, she mentioned the tension to a colleague. Nothing alarming, she said, just uncomfortable. She was advised to be cautious, to document interactions, to trust her instincts. She nodded, but deep down, she believed things would settle. Most people do. The man, however, felt urgency, not fear, clarity. He had lived long enough to recognize when time mattered, when words needed to be recorded, not just spoken. He arranged a private meeting. He asked questions. He made choices. The process was calm, thoughtful, final. He believed clarity would end confusion, that transparency would dissolve suspicion. Instead, it hardened it. When the family learned that decisions had been finalized, reactions shifted again. Concern gave way to panic. Polite disagreement turned into outrage. This was no longer about care. It was about loss. Loss of expectation, loss of control, loss of something assumed. The caregiver felt it immediately. Messages became sharper. Requests became demands. One conversation stood out. Accusations were implied, not stated. Her integrity questioned without evidence. She left that day feeling unsettled, not scared, just aware. Awareness changes behavior. She checked her surroundings more often. She varied her routine slightly. She kept her phone closer. Still, She did not believe she was in danger. That word felt too strong, too dramatic. Life, after all, had always rewarded caution with resolution. The man struggled with guilt again. He worried that his decisions had placed her in a difficult position. That kindness had consequences neither of them anticipated. He apologized for the tension. She reassured him, neither truly convinced. The home camera continued recording quietly, capturing nothing remarkable, just routine. That is how risk often appears, unremarkable. Days passed, no confrontation, no threats, just quiet observation. What no one realized was that once a decision feels irreversible, some people stop looking for solutions. They start looking for outcomes, and in that silence, something irreversible was already taking shape. What happens when everyday movements become predictable, and predictability is mistaken for safety? By this point, routine had become a kind of armor. The caregiver relied on it to feel steady. The man relied on it to feel normal. Morning greetings stayed the same. Meals were prepared with care. Conversations flowed gently, as they always had. Yet beneath that surface, both sensed a quiet countdown. Not in numbers, in feelings. The caregiver began to notice how often the same faces appeared nearby. Not directly watching, just present. She told herself it was coincidence, that noticing patterns did not mean patterns were real. Still, she adjusted small things. She left a little earlier some days. She stayed a little later on others. The man observed her changes. He recognized caution when he saw it. He asked again if she felt unsafe. She paused longer this time, then said she felt uneasy, not threatened. That distinction mattered to her. It made the feeling manageable. Family communication had nearly stopped. No more check-ins, no more questions. The silence was unsettling, not peaceful, strategic. The man understood this kind of silence well. He had spent years in business before retirement. He knew when negotiations ended and decisions began. He tried reaching out. Calls went unanswered. Messages received no response. He realized then that reconciliation was no longer the goal. Meanwhile, the caregiver went about her life outside the home. Errands, appointments, simple tasks that fill ordinary days. She did not know these routines were being memorized. Times noted, routes remembered. Predictability feels harmless, until it isn't. On one quiet afternoon, the man shared a personal plan, something hopeful, something meant to bring reassurance. He wanted to look ahead, not dwell on conflict, not live in fear of reactions. She smiled, she encouraged him. Neither noticed how heavy the moment truly was. That evening, as she prepared to leave, everything felt normal. The same goodbye, the same calm. The home camera recorded another quiet moment. No raised voices, no visible tension, just the end of a workday. Outside the home, the world continued as usual. Traffic moved, lights changed, people passed each other without noticing. The caregiver followed her routine. She did not rush. She did not look over her shoulder. Trust does that. It keeps your gaze forward. What she could not see was how familiar her routine had become to others. How easily normal had been mapped. Later, investigators would study patterns. They would trace movements backward. They would see how predictability opened doors without force. At the time, none of that was visible. There was only the sense that something was wrong, without a clear reason why. A feeling many people ignore, because acknowledging it feels like admitting fear. And fear, when it comes too late, no longer protects. That evening marked the last time routine felt harmless, the last moment before familiarity became vulnerability. And once that line is crossed, there is no simple way back. Errand turned into a moment that changes everything. The caregiver left the house as she always did. Nothing about her mood suggested concern. She was tired, but calm, focused on small tasks waiting at home. She followed familiar streets, passed the same stores, moved through the world on autopilot, as most people do after a long day. This was the comfort of routine. It reduced stress. It freed the mind. She parked where she often parked. Not hidden, not isolated, just quiet enough to feel convenient. She stepped out, thinking only of what she needed to pick up. Simple items, nothing urgent. Moments like this rarely feel important. They fade as soon as they pass. What she did not know was that timing mattered. That observation had replaced chance. That familiarity had been mistaken for invisibility. Nearby, movement went unnoticed. Not because it was aggressive, but because it blended in. Most people do not expect danger in places they visit often. The brain filters it out. Normal becomes invisible. When the caregiver did not return home later that evening, concern did not arrive immediately. Delays happen. Phones run out of power. Plans change. Hours passed before worry settled in. At the man's home, the night grew quiet. He waited, checked the time, told himself she was simply busy. But waiting changes when it stretches too long. He reached for the phone. No answer. That feeling arrived slowly. Not panic, unease. He called again, then again. Still nothing. By morning, the routine had broken. The absence felt loud. Authorities were notified. Questions began. Details gathered. Investigators started with the ordinary. A car left behind, personal items untouched, signs of interruption. Not chaos, just interruption. This mattered. They spoke with the man. He shared everything. The care, the tension, the family conflict. Nothing was withheld. The family was contacted next. Their responses were controlled, measured, careful. No obvious cracks, no visible urgency. Investigations often begin slowly. They rely on patterns, on timelines, on the small details people forget they shared. In this case, attention returned to routine, where she went, when she left, who knew her schedule, and slowly predictability became the central question. The home camera footage was reviewed, not for action, but for context. It showed affection, consistency, nothing forced. This detail mattered more than anyone expected. As the search expanded, tension deepened. The man stopped sleeping, stopped eating. He replayed conversations in his mind, wondered if he should have insisted she leave earlier, if he should have said more. Guilt filled the quiet. Meanwhile, investigators followed financial records, phone activity, connections, not because violence had been obvious, but because motive often hides in quiet places. Each step forward revealed how close observation had been, how small decisions had been tracked. The caregiver's routine, once a source of stability, had become a trail. And as the investigation widened, it became clear that this disappearance was not random. It was deliberate. That realization would change everything. Answers do not arrive. How long does hope hold before it begins to change shape? Days passed without news. Not dramatic days. Quiet ones filled with waiting. Search efforts expanded carefully. Investigators reviewed footage. They spoke with shop employees. They asked about unfamiliar vehicles. Nothing obvious surfaced at first. The man remained at home, surrounded by silence. Every sound felt louder than it should have been. Every hour felt longer. He kept his phone close, as if willpower alone could make it ring. Family members reached out again, this time with concern. At least on the surface, their words were supportive, their tone controlled. They asked what the authorities believed. The man answered honestly, that there were no answers yet. Behind closed doors, investigators focused on connections. Who benefited from her absence? Who felt threatened by her presence? This was not about suspicion. It was about logic. The caregiver's life was examined piece by piece. No history of conflict, no hidden debts, no reason to disappear willingly. Her routines were simple, predictable, public. That made the silence louder. Attention turned toward communication records, calls, messages, moments when coordination requires words. Patterns emerged, not dramatic ones, subtle. Contacts that increased suddenly, conversations that stopped just as suddenly. Financial activity raised questions, withdrawals, unusual timing. None of it proved anything on its own. But together it told a story of preparation. The man was informed carefully, not all at once. Only what he needed to know. He listened quietly. His expression did not change much, but something inside him hardened. He realized then that trust had not just been broken. It had been used. Hope began to shift, but transform. It became quieter, more cautious. Investigators located a property that stood out, unused, unmonitored, easy to overlook. They approached it methodically, not expecting certainty, just possibility. What they found confirmed their direction. The discovery was handled with respect. Details kept minimal, focus maintained on evidence. For the man, the confirmation arrived gently, delivered by someone trained to speak softly. Grief does not arrive all at once. It arrives in waves, each one heavier than the last. He asked few questions. He did not need many answers. What mattered was that she would not be returning. The investigation moved faster after that. Phone records connected, locations aligned, timelines matched. What had once looked like coincidence now looked intentional. The family was questioned again, this time separately. Their stories were consistent, too consistent. Consistency can be comforting, or it can be rehearsed. Investigators knew the difference. As pressure increased, cracks began to form. Not in words, in reactions. A pause too long. An answer too precise. Truth rarely needs polish. The man was no longer waiting for a call. He was waiting for accountability. And that wait, though painful, was finally moving forward. What happens when evidence begins to speak louder than explanations? As the investigation deepened, the tone shifted. This was no longer a search defined by absence. It became a process of connection. Investigators compared timelines. They aligned movements. They followed data that did not forget. Phone records revealed coordination, not emotional calls, brief, functional ones, messages that arrived at precise moments, messages that stopped suddenly afterward. These details mattered. They suggested awareness. They suggested planning. Financial records added another layer. Large amounts moved in short windows, withdrawals that did not match routine spending. Each detail alone could be explained. Together, they formed intent. Investigators approached interviews differently now. They listened more, spoke less. When people feel safe, they fill silence. When they feel cornered, they control it. The family's answers grew careful. Their words measured. Their emotions contained. Contained emotions can be appropriate, or they can signal restraint. Attention shifted to outside connections. Individuals known for handling problems quietly. People who operated on the edge of legality. These connections were not obvious at first. They appeared through overlapping contacts, shared histories, brief interactions. Surveillance data confirmed meetings, not dramatic ones, short encounters in neutral places. Enough to exchange information, enough to arrange outcomes. When these findings were presented, responses changed. Defensiveness replaced calm. Denial grew sharper. One person began to distance themselves verbally. Subtle shifts, language that placed responsibility elsewhere. This mattered. Investigations often turn on moments like this, not confessions, but redirection. The man was informed again. This time, the update carried weight. He listened, still and silent. Then asked a single question. Why? The answer was not complicated. It was painful in its simplicity. Money, control, fear of loss. The caregiver had represented change, a shift in future expectations. For some, change feels like threat. As arrests were prepared, investigators moved carefully. They wanted clarity. They wanted certainty. When those involved were confronted with the evidence, reactions varied. Some remained quiet. Some argued details. One broke, not in emotion, in words. They explained coordination, timing, roles, nothing dramatic, just factual. The story that emerged was methodical, planned, detached. Hearing this, the man closed his eyes, not in disbelief, in understanding. He had mistaken distance for indifference. He had underestimated resentment. The investigation reached its final stage. Charges were prepared. Consequences became unavoidable. As the legal process began, the home camera footage resurfaced, not as proof of wrongdoing, but as proof of humanity. It showed two people sharing trust. Nothing more. That trust had been seen as a weakness, a vulnerability, and now that vulnerability stood at the center of accountability. The quiet routine that once defined safety had led here, and the weight of that realization would not fade easily. It becomes unavoidable. How do people explain choices they never planned to defend? The legal process moved forward quietly. No crowds, no spectacle, just procedure. Investigators organized what they had learned: records, messages, financial trails, patterns of movement. Each piece was ordinary on its own. Together, they told a complete story. The caregiver's absence was no longer a mystery. It was a result. Interviews continued, this time with less patience. Questions were precise. Answers were tested against evidence. Some responses stayed firm. Others shifted slightly. A word changed here. A pause stretched there. Truth rarely breaks all at once. It bends first. One individual chose cooperation, not out of remorse, out of pressure. They spoke in simple terms, about conversations that felt necessary, about decisions framed as solutions, about moments when hesitation was dismissed as weakness. There was no shouting, no emotional release, just explanation. That tone unsettled investigators more than anger would have. It suggested distance from consequence. The caregiver was often referred to indirectly, as an obstacle, as a complication, not as a person. Language reveals how choices are justified. The man was informed when arrests were made. He listened carefully. He did not celebrate. He did not cry. He asked about process, about what would happen next. His focus was forward, not because he had healed, but because he needed structure. He had lost routine once already. He would not lose it again. As court proceedings began, attention turned to motive. Why go this far? Why not step back? The answer returned again and again to expectation, what people believed they were owed, what they feared losing. Care, when given freely, had disrupted that belief. Presence had shifted priorities. Gratitude had replaced obligation. For some, that shift felt unacceptable. The caregiver's role was reframed in arguments, as influence, as interference. But evidence told a quieter truth: consistent behavior, clear boundaries, no deception. The home camera footage was reviewed again, not to provoke emotion, but to establish context. It showed care without urgency, affection without performance. The man watched it privately later. He asked for the room to be cleared. Seeing it did not comfort him. It reminded him of what had been normal, of what had been taken. Outside the courtroom, life continued. Traffic moved, people passed without noticing. Inside, accountability took shape. Those responsible faced consequences defined by law, not by revenge, not by emotion. Still, consequences do not end with sentencing. They ripple. The man returned home to a quieter house. Care continued, but it felt different. Trust takes time to rebuild, sometimes longer than grief. As proceedings closed, one question remained unspoken. Not about guilt, not about punishment, but about how easily ordinary care became a threat, and whether anyone had noticed the warning signs soon enough. The process ends, what remains for those who are left behind? After the legal decisions were finalized, the pace slowed. There were no more interviews, no more questions to answer. Silence returned. But it felt different than before. The man remained in his home, surrounded by reminders, not objects, moments. A chair positioned near the window, music that no longer played in the afternoons, quiet spaces where conversation once lived. Care continued through professionals assigned by agencies. They were kind, competent, respectful, but connection cannot be replaced by procedure. He found himself replaying small memories, shared meals, simple jokes, ordinary days that had once felt endless. Now they felt brief. Investigators closed their files. The case moved from active to resolved, from present to past. But resolution on paper does not equal peace. The family did not return, not out of absence, out of distance. What remained between them could not be repaired by time alone. Trust had collapsed completely. The man understood this. He did not reach out again. Instead, he focused on small, controllable choices, daily routines, consistent care, quiet reflection. He spoke less, listened more. Those around him noticed the change. Not sadness exactly, stillness. He had learned something painful about loyalty, about how presence can matter more than history. The caregiver's influence lingered, not as a memory frozen in grief, but as a standard. Caregivers who followed noticed his expectations. He valued patience, conversation, respect. These were not demands, they were lessons. In broader conversations, the case became a cautionary example, not publicly, quietly among professionals, about boundaries, about documentation, about recognizing early signs of tension. The system responded in small ways. Procedures adjusted. Awareness increased. No system can prevent every outcome, but attention can change direction. For the man, days continued one at a time. He no longer waited for calls. He no longer planned far ahead. He lived in moments, carefully. Sometimes he revisited the video. Not often, only when memory felt too heavy. He did not watch it to relive loss. He watched it to remember trust, trust that had once existed naturally, without fear. The home felt quieter but not empty. He filled it with structure, with reflection. What had been taken could not be returned, but what had been learned remained. The story no longer belonged to investigation or courtrooms. It belonged to consequence. Consequence does not shout, it settles. And as life moved forward, one question lingered quietly. How many ordinary routines hide risks no one notices until it is too late? When everything appears settled, why does unease sometimes remain? Time continued forward, as it always does. Days passed into weeks. Weeks softened into routine again. From the outside, the situation looked resolved. The investigation had ended. Responsibility had been assigned. Procedures had been followed. But closure is not a single moment. It is a process, and processes take time. The man adjusted to a quieter rhythm. Care arrived on schedule. Meals were prepared. Medication was managed. Life continued, but it no longer expanded. He spent more time thinking than speaking, more time observing than reacting. Sometimes he reflected on how easily trust had grown, how naturally it had formed through consistency, not promises, how care, offered without expectation, had reshaped his days. That transformation had felt safe, it had felt earned. Understanding that it had also created vulnerability was difficult to accept. Investigators, long finished with their work, moved on to new cases. But some details stayed with them. Not because of complexity, but because of familiarity. Nothing in this case had relied on secrecy alone. It relied on routine, on predictability. That realization stayed with them. In professional circles, quiet conversations continued about how caregivers can become central figures in someone's life, about how that closeness can be misunderstood, about how suspicion can grow when expectations are challenged. These conversations were not accusatory, they were reflective. The goal was not fear, it was awareness. The man, meanwhile, faced another reality: longevity. He had lived long enough to know that loss does not always arrive suddenly. Sometimes it arrives in slow recognition. He recognized that his final years would look different than he had imagined. Not because of physical limits, but because emotional safety had changed. Trust would return slowly, if at all. Not because caregivers were unkind, but because familiarity now carried risk in his mind. Still, he tried. He spoke gently. He listened carefully. He did not want fear to define what remained of his life. Occasionally, he revisited the idea that had caused so much tension, the belief that gratitude should matter, that presence should count. He did not regret his choices. Even now, what he regretted was how others responded to them. In quiet moments, he wondered how many people make similar choices every day. Trusting routines, trusting relationships, believing that kindness will be understood. Most of the time it is. But this case stood as a reminder that misunderstanding can harden into something dangerous when left unaddressed. The home camera remained in place, still recording, still silent. It had captured nothing extraordinary, just routine. That routine had been enough to change everything. As the man looked ahead, he no longer asked what could have been done differently. That question led nowhere. Instead, he asked how awareness could protect others, how attention to small warning signs might matter. Because danger does not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives disguised as concern. And when it does, it often targets the most ordinary parts of life. After everything has been decided, what lessons quietly remain? The story did not end with a final decision or a closed file. It continued in smaller ways, in conversations held privately, in habits adjusted without announcement. The man lived on with a careful sense of awareness, not fear. Awareness. He paid attention to details he once ignored: who entered his space, how information moved between people, how silence could mean different things depending on who held it. Care became structured again, professional, clear. Boundaries were respected, schedules were shared openly, nothing was left to assumption. This brought a kind of calm, not warmth, but stability. For him, stability was enough. He spent time reflecting on how easily everyday trust is built, through repetition, through kindness, through showing up. Trust does not ask to be questioned, it simply grows. That is what made its loss so confusing. There had been no warning that felt serious enough, no moment that clearly said, this will end badly. Only small signals: unease, tension, silence. Signals many people experience and dismiss. Professionals who later discussed the case spoke less about crime and more about human behavior, about how resentment can hide behind concern, about how control can disguise itself as protection. They spoke about routines, how they make life easier, and how they can also make people visible. Awareness, they agreed, is not about suspicion. It is about balance. The caregiver's absence left more than grief. It left questions about how care is valued, how presence is interpreted, how gratitude can be mistaken for influence. The man did not speak publicly about these thoughts. He carried them quietly. When asked how he was doing, he answered simply, taking it one day at a time. It was an honest response. The home remained quiet, not empty, just still. He spent more time by the window, watching the world move without him, traffic passing, neighbors coming and going. Life continued, unaware of what had happened inside those walls. That, too, was part of the lesson. Most lives intersect briefly, then move on. What stays are the effects, the shifts in behavior, the cautious pauses before trust is given again. This story is not about fear, it is about attention. About recognizing that ordinary routines can change slowly, that emotional shifts often arrive before visible ones. It reminds us that care, when misunderstood, can create conflict instead of comfort, and that silence, when left unexamined, can grow dangerous. The man carried this understanding with him, not as bitterness, but as clarity. He had learned that personal safety is not just about locks or cameras. It is about communication, transparency, and listening to discomfort before it hardens. In the end, what remained was not anger. It was awareness. Awareness that trust is powerful, that it deserves protection, and that when routines begin to feel heavy instead of comforting, it may be time to pause and look closer. Because the most important warnings are often the quiet ones. If ordinary trust can shape a life so deeply, how do we protect it without letting fear take its place? In the months that followed, the man's world grew smaller, but clearer. He no longer rushed conversations. He listened carefully. He asked questions when something felt unclear. This was not suspicion. It was respect for reality. Care continued in his home, steady and professional. Boundaries were openly discussed. Expectations were written, not assumed. These steps did not erase loss, but they reduced confusion. Emotionally, he carried two truths at once: that care had once given him joy, and that misunderstanding had turned that joy into conflict. Both could exist together. He often reflected on how trust begins, not with grand gestures, but with small, repeated actions. A meal prepared the right way, music played at the right moment, someone remembering what matters to you. These things feel harmless, they feel safe. Yet this story showed how easily care can be misread by others, how presence can threaten expectations, how silence can replace conversation when discomfort is avoided. The consequences were irreversible, not because of care itself, but because concerns were never addressed openly. That realization stayed with him. In quiet moments, he imagined a different outcome, not one without loss, but one with earlier communication, clear conversations, acknowledged fears, shared understanding. Perhaps nothing would have changed, or perhaps everything would have. He accepted that he would never know. What he did know was this: personal safety is not just physical, it is emotional. It lives in how openly people speak and how carefully they listen. For caregivers, this story carried its own weight. It reminded them that kindness, while powerful, must be protected by clarity. That documentation is not distrust, that intuition deserves attention. For families, it offered a different reflection. That care given by others does not erase connection. It does not steal importance. It fills absence. When that truth is resisted, harm can follow. The man did not share these thoughts publicly. He lived them quietly. He found comfort in structure, in predictability that was transparent, not hidden. The home camera still recorded, but now it felt symbolic rather than protective. It reminded him that not everything important is visible, and not everything visible is understood. As his days continued, he focused less on what had been taken and more on what remained: his voice, his choices, his awareness. He had learned at great cost that trust must be supported by conversation, that silence can be as powerful as words, and that ordinary routines deserve reflection when they begin to feel heavy. This story does not ask for fear, it asks for attention. Attention to discomfort before it becomes conflict. Attention to silence before it becomes distance. Attention to the people who show up quietly and consistently. Because trust is built slowly. And when it is misunderstood, the consequences do not arrive loudly. They arrive quietly, like a routine that changes without warning.